Good evening, everyone. My name is Khalil. I'm the curator of Portrait of a Nation 2, and I will be moderating our panel tonight. The title of our panel is Reclaiming Reimagining Home, Exploring Notions of Belonging. Allow me to introduce our panelists. Maryam Wissam Al-Dabbagh, born in Dubai in 1982. Maryam is a writer, researcher, and cultural communications consultant. She received a BA in journalism from the American University of Sharjah and an MA in global media and post-national communication from SOAS, London. Her research is focused on the Arab diaspora in the Gulf and exile, especially through the lens of belonging and return. She's concerned with archiving and storytelling as tools to record marginalized histories and forgotten pasts. Maryam is co-founder of Ru'ya, which has become one of the leading Emirati cultural communications companies since it was established in 2017. She has worked on campaigns for the Sharjah Art Foundation, Art Dubai, the UAE Pavilion in 2013, and the 2013 Venice Biennial. She's also founding director of Ila Al-Amam agency, which provides specialized content to culture organizations. In 2019, Dabbagh was named one of Apollo magazine's 40 under 40 Middle East. Albaik, born in 1991 in Abu Dhabi, she currently serves as program manager for Warehouse 41 in Abu Dhabi. Albaik holds an MFA from Rhode Island School of Design and a Bachelor of Architecture from the American University of Sharjah. May's works come together as performance, video, sculpture, and installations, and layers personal poetics onto the socio-political that define relationships to geography. She looks for moments of both mediated and immediate contact between place, body, and language. Her early practice developed out of the oral narration of her family's history, the story of her grandfather's exile from Palestine, and the winding path through geopolitical and cultural landscapes that led to where she is now, a non-citizen resident of her country of birth. An alumna of the Salama Emerging Artists Fellowship, SIV, Albaik recently opened her first solo show, A Iranian Love Note, at Tashkil in Dubai. Hashel Lamki was born in the UAE in 1986. In 2007, he joined a Bachelor of Fine Arts program at Parsons, the New School for Design in New York City. His practice focuses on social innovation, sustainability, environmental, and philanthropic work. After 7 years in New York City, he spent another year between Amsterdam and Taos, New Mexico, before returning to the Emirates. These cities has a lasting impact on Lamki as an architect and artist. Upon returning to Abu Dhabi in 2017, he completed the Salama bint Hamdan Emerging Artists Fellowship. He then joined forces together with fellow artists and launched Bait 15, an artist-run gallery space that provided a home for local artists to engage in critical dialogue. His most recent exhibitions include The Cup and the Saucer at Warehouse 41 in 2020 and Beyond at Abu Dhabi Art in 2021. Home is a mode that must be continuously renegotiated. A state of flux is at the center of our conversation today. I'm going to start my first question with a very recurring question, which each one of us gets asked often. Where are you from? And how do you answer this question? Maryam?
Thank you, Maya. Thank you for the lovely introduction. I'm really happy to be here. This is by far the most difficult question I've ever been asked, or do I ever get asked. I think I've reconciled with an answer for now. So today, I am Iraqi, but Emirati born and raised. So my parents are originally Iraqi, but I'm an Emirati born and raised, married to a Lebanese who is half Egyptian and can speak all of the Arab dialects except the Libyan. Haven't perfected that yet. So today I am both Emirati and both Iraqi.
Maze?
I'm not where you are in life yet. I often think of it as flipping a coin before I answer this question. I tend to just say I'm from the UAE rather than, as the sort of the shorthand. More often than not, that's never kind of accepted. And it's like, oh, but. I think what I'm arriving at is that when that first point of contact is not enough for someone who's asking this question, I actually will just give myself permission to just kind of divulge my family history, essentially. Which is not that, elaborate, but I'll say, Palestinian Syrian, born and raised my whole life in the UAE.
All right. Yeah. We're going to get deeper into this concept. Hashel.
Yes. I'm also like similar on the same boat, like trying to kind of like find out like where the Google drop pin, but I think like 7 years ago when I first moved back from New York, there was like 6 months that I spent in Al Ain, and I think that was like the a pivotal point in my life where I kind of like finally accepted where I'm from and kind of like made that decision that I think it's important to acknowledge, regardless of like the geopolitical like association with identity, I think the city where you realize your senses always like have a valid kind of importance in us in finding our identity. And I think for me in Al Ain, where I kind of like developed, all of these senses there, I have to like give it its credit and like just say I'm from Al Ain.
Okay. There is this concept, home is where the heart is. But also there is the idea of, we found ourselves very often in places of estrangement. And very often also these places of estrangement turn into places where we find ourselves we need to engage with, and where could be a source for creativity, for fecundity. Can we comment a little bit on this, Maryam?
I think there's a lot of contention in the word home, but there's also a lot of warmth and a lot of familiarity. And I think the nature of my profession and my passion as a translator is I always think of it in Arabic. And the word home in Arabic has so many translations. So it could be as simple as describing the physical place, al-manzil. It could be ad-dar, which is a bit more poetic and more, more contextual to the UAE. It could be al-watan, which is very heavy and very loaded. And it could be al-mawtan, which is slightly lighter than al-watan. So when I think of home, I don't think of home in its English kind of final state. I think of home, but because I am, primarily an Arabic speaker, and I speak Arabic in my heart, and then I translate to English in my brain, and that's how I'm speaking right now. So everything is being instantly translated in my brain from Arabic to English. Home becomes a very powerful terminology for me because it keeps ringing, it keeps playing between watan and manzil, watan and dar. So an actual physical home and a place to belong. So I don't know how to answer this. I realize that I don't know how to answer this with academic jargon, although believe it or not, I spent 5 years of my academic life just learning all that jargon that theorizes home. And I know all the theories and I've read all the books, but I think the simplest realization I found is home is familiarity. And home is a bit of sadness and a bit of huzn, as Orhan Pamuk often describes. There's an element of huzn, so that feeling of melancholy and also love and passion and happiness and familiarity that come all together. So home resembles that, but I also found that home for me is the archive of the past. So it's the proof of existence. For me, personally.
Let's contextualize this, especially with the piece that you're participating with in Portrait of a Nation 2, Beyond Narratives. It's called Library Circle, and this is a piece that you first participated with in Jamil Art Center, and it's a story, and you base it on the story of Shahrazad, which continuously, almost like a story of survival, because she kept on a day after day, she needed to tell that story that would keep her alive the following day. and you drew a bit parallels to your being in the UAE.
Okay. So in 2020, I was commissioned by Jameel Art Center to write a piece for their library. And it was a textual piece. And I'm a writer. I never defined myself as an artist. So this is officially the first time that I am described as an artist. And I don't have a problem with that description. I think art is a very expansive kind of term that can include everything. And writing is definitely a form of art. And art somehow sometimes is a form of writing. I remember when I was writing, I was concerned, and I still am, in the personal archives of families that have lived here. Because as we approached our Golden Jubilee as a nation, there's this immense sense of pride, right? Especially for people who have seen the nation grow. So my father has come to the UAE 44 years ago. So the UAE was only 6 years old when my dad arrived. And so for my dad, the Golden Jubilee for my father means way more than it means to me and to the younger generation, of course, and to people who have just arrived here. And while I was going through the personal archive of my family, I realized that there's footage and there are letters and there are documents and files of my family's history that is part of the country's history, but this is the kind of history that is usually not nationalized, right? The history of families is not the history you find in museums anywhere in the world. And it made me think, how do you write the history of a place, any place, without really digging into the history of the people that are part of this place? And so I started writing the story, but because I am not from here, but I'm also from here, I had to write the story in a way to protect myself and to protect the family. And this sense of protection is, if you ask me, protect you from what? I don't know how to answer that. I don't know from what. But there is a sense of protection. So I fictionalized the story. So it became fiction. And when I was thinking of fiction, I was like, all right, every moment I was writing, I knew that there was an interruption of a 2-year mark because the visa is renewed every 2 years. Of a place that I call home. So every 2 years, my permanence is reminded of its temporality. So I realized that this also reminds me of Shahrazad, because Shahrazad every night had to repeat a story in order for her to survive. And for us, it felt like we needed to continue the story every 2 years for us to stay. And so started the mélange between Arabic and English and the Kanya Makan. But really what it is, it's fictionalizing my family's archive into Arabic and English.
It's very interesting what you said. I'm very interested in what you said now, that you had, in a way, to almost like reinvent or reassess that your presence. But I think, Hashel, you do it in a different way. I'm surprised that the younger generation in the UAE is quite engaged with the idea of memory, and which is, for me, I would have expected to look forward, to look at the future and to shape that future. But you went back. Why, and why now? Why when you came back from New York?
Yeah, I think memory and just contextualizing what's been happening for the past 50 years. As a nation, our possibilities economically are so fluid that we are on a fast pace of construction boom. There is a lot of understanding of the self and the other, so therefore policies are changing, things are shaping up, and because it's happening so fast, you lose sense of track of a reference point, because I mean, architecturally, or the spaces that I grew up in Al Ain, when you go back, they no longer exist. Family picnics or family road trips that I did, you go to those places and they're so foreign that it made me, when I first came back from New York and we started Bait 15 with a group of artists, an artist-run studio space, an exhibition space that existed for 5 years almost. The first thing that I did is actually deal with myself and understand and accept where I'm from. And that's where like Versailles was born, the piece that I'm showing here. I just got, it was a villa, and like we distributed the bedrooms into like studio spaces. And the first thing I did is like just fill the walls with empty canvases from the floor to the ceiling, and like just maximize my expression and like dealing with that. And I started like digging deep and like trying to pull all of these reference points from Al Ain, and in particular in perspective of like memory and distortion, as we are like, as I mentioned, that we are like on a fast-paced, and there are like very specific moments. If you're familiar with Al Ain, you know, you have the mountain, Jabal Hafir. It's interesting. The tectonic plate like separated from Africa, and it moved to its current plate now. It's separating by 5 centimeters north every year. So what appears to be static is actually also moving. And I also come from a mixed race family. So that also like ties in like the whole conversation. My late father worked in ADNOC, and I saw the progress of the ADNOC gas stations from like just being a source of energy to like be like a social space where, you know, with the development of the ADNOC oasis, and you see families going there on weekends to have a meal. There is like several gas stations that we know among each other, like dates take place. So there's like these different like cute memories about like these
But
spaces.
there's one
Yeah.
work that does not belong to the series of memories of Al Ain.
Yes, it's the future. It's the Louvre Abu Dhabi, and it's kind of like this idea of like, kind of like, there was a moment in my practice where I was like dealing with departure and linger, and like how you go forward, but you also like get pulled back in a way. And where I'm at right now as an artist, and the future, you have the Louvre, and hopefully soon Guggenheim is going to open, and all of that. So we're like shifting from slowly like what, you know, used to be like foreign to like actually see the development. And like obviously culture like plays a huge role in shaping, you know, so there's these institutions that also help us to understand.
But there's something that you said that actually rings, like makes sense. I think when you're talking about memory, and going back to your first question about home, I think for me specifically, being the generation of the 90s, right? So I'm a child of the 90s, and I've witnessed some of the, in my opinion, some of the best years of the UAE so far. And I think there's an essence of home being in the past as well. So al-watan huwa al-madi. In a way, there's the process of archiving and preserving these memories, because there's a part of me that believes that there's an element of home, like a homing element in the past, that is now like you cling to it because you're also part of this rapid development, right? You're part of this rapid progress. I mean, look at us now. I remember when the weekend shifted from Thursday, Friday to Friday, Saturday. I remember how disoriented we were in school, and now I'm witnessing the second kind of generation of change, and this is all happening in my lifespan, and I'm still young. So it's like you hold on to the past in a way, and your past becomes your home. I think maybe there's also tension there.
And you know, the home in the past thing feels really close to what you were saying with melancholy is part of home. I think a lot actually about there is a sense of melancholic quiet, or sort of a down. There's a down thing, you know, that comes with actually just going back to your parents' house. And I think it comes from realizing that the experience that makes something, you know, or that attaches a term so loaded as home, occurs without you realizing it's occurring. And I find it an extremely indispensable part of the familiarity of
But-
home. Should I jump in? I wanted to
No,
actually...
yeah, I just wanted
yeah.
to tell you, because you're talking about familiarity, and actually you
Yeah.
created something that's completely not non-familiar. So you have a digital installation, you imagine a weather forecast of a place called Al-Makan, which is a fictitious digital nation state. So how do you contend with the impossibility or possibility, actually, of localizing the internet, the digital idea of the nation state within the context of belonging?
You know, you started the question with home is where the heart is. And I think the thing that makes that term really stick is that it's so vague it could mean anything. And actually it's sort of me arriving at thinking of an alternative way of understanding belonging and home. Right now in retrospect I can kind of trace it linearly, and kind of from there actually where I wanted to actually realize, can I list what actually makes something a home? It's born out of wanting to control how I attach pathos to the space around me. And I think, there was a certain period where I wanted to think about home is where the body is. Home is where, a place we talk about a lot. Maybe that's closer to what you think about the heart is, but also home is where there is struggle. And there is a struggle that you do not necessarily want to escape from. It's a struggle that you want to go through. And I think, through a few different pieces, I've wanted to really think about the bodily experience of home, and then it's the parallel, or sort of maybe even the opposite, which is not bodily experience of home, which is something that is ubiquitous in a lot of different kind of diasporic experiences, right? You talk about home, you remember, or you see photos, etc. And I maybe went through all these kind of existential questions and arrived at a bit of a frustration, which just feels like there is never gratification of home, even when you go back to the exact same space that you've always been. It's the melancholia, right? But it's also actually a form of disappointment or non-reciprocity, in a sense. When you were saying you don't know what you're protecting yourself from, when you want, or your family from, I immediately was thinking, it's almost like being worried you would be a jilted lover, being worried of not having those acknowledgements of a place reciprocated. And I think, so I've arrived at a sort of frustration of, can I, and again, it comes kind of from wanting to control my relationship to place. Can I actually just imagine a completely different way of attaching myself to a location or a place, etc. And a lot of that actually came from conversations with Maryam, because an early iteration of the piece here, the weather forecast, was in collaboration with Maryam, where we wanted to dig into the terms that we use to define the relationship of bodies to place, and very much a bureaucratic terms. And here, and basically the way that grew is I was like, okay, there's something really interesting about an incorporeal location, still stubbornly trying to create classifications of bodies and their relationship to place. And in a sort of playful way, I kind of wanted to go in and start world building, essentially. And there is a little bit of a satirical, kind of jokey imprint to it, but I think I keep going back to the frustration of imagining a different way of our bodies existing in those places.
But I was surprised with that you actually incorporated these divisions within your weather forecast, because you almost give a different weather forecast, a different experience to whether you are a tourist, whether you're a citizen, whether you're an expat.
Yeah, and
Can you elaborate? Why?
Yeah, I can. I mean, I don't know if I can elaborate, but I'll tell you that also this whole body of work has become a bit almost revelatory to myself about myself as well, because I find it also difficult. I am finding it difficult to even begin to imagine, even though that's
What?
from the onset is what I set out to do, to begin to imagine a way that is not like capital C committed to kind of a current state of affairs. And I think there's that tension of defining ourselves with or against pre-existing kind of frameworks, but also, you know, the very recognizable state iconography that keeps kind of popping up. And there is something there that I think I really want to get into and still find myself unable to step out of my body's experience of. But that I have a little bit of hope that, you know, slowly we build a vocabulary
Okay.
to think beyond these terms, to think beyond these visuals, etc.
Yeah, the vocabulary is quite important also in how you define home. So it's not only a space, but it's also a mode of communication. It's a way of communicating. Hashel, Mace was talking, and Mace and Maryam both mentioned this idea of melancholia in terms of the home, and also Mace was talking how you get sometimes disappointed by your visit or revisiting a place. But I didn't feel that that was the case for you. I felt that it was more like regrounding yourself before you set off again.
Yeah, I think the way I look at the past is for me it's a positive space to kind of like, as you said, like found grounding and like kind of like land somewhere, because I've always like believed in like the idea of like the global citizen and being in New York, and like, yeah, we're all like, you know, we come from different places and it's all about like the individual. But I think I always like question like what grounds you, you know, that's an important question. And looking back, it wasn't like melancholic in a way that it was like just foreign for me to accept everything, and it's like part of also adulthood and being mature to accept, you know, that part of my journey in general. And in my case, I don't know, there is like elements of sadness, obviously, because like if you look at the work, it's all abandoned spaces. You know, these are like still like super active spaces. Things happen there, but the way I look at them, they're very like in a very neutral way from the lens of a painter. But then the excitement comes through color, because like that's something that I inherited also through my other side of my race, where, you know, growing up between Al Ain and Kenya, like, you know, being in a extremely vibrant, like colorful space, but then coming back to what like appears to be like also a monotone. So I was like in conversation between those two worlds, and then kind of like navigate through that. But I do agree, like, I think sadness is elegant, you know, it's kind of like, you know, you don't want to be like...
What's in the title? Versailles.
Oh, the title, actually, that was like a conversation I had with Munira Sayer, who curated my first solo shot, Warehouse 421. And for the longest time throughout our process for 2 years, it was always like between my studio and my living space. And we were like developing the work and like slowly like coming up with like 9 sub-themes for the show. And we started like kind of like breaking it down into like more digestible ideas. And at that, towards the end, she invited me over to her house, and I don't know if I can say this, but the color green is actually their dining room, where we had like one of the last meetings. And Munira's mom is very collector, and I don't know how, I'm trying to not overshare. but that like we had a moment like where we felt like the way the space that I was working in and the meeting room space like had a similarity, and I was like, do you live in Versailles? Like, this feels
Okay.
like Versailles. And then she's like, yeah. And that's how the name developed. It's a term of endearment for sure. It's not necessarily like associating anything with what Versailles is or
Yeah.
like the history of that place, but the idea of like accessibility, you know, like what used to be like super private, it's like super public now. It's super accessible in the sense of, you know, we all like just buy a ticket and go to the White House or Qasr al-Hissan or Qasr al, you know, like the idea of like home also on a larger scale is very important. Like it's cascaded down to every individual. We all like chase the same dream. We're all like, if you're Emirati, you're trying to like build a house. If you're working here, you're saving to build a house somewhere else. So there's like that like sense of like trying to give hope to everyone.
Now that you mentioned this, in terms of this idea of building or maybe even transferring, Maryam, in your story, you mentioned at one point that you experienced that feeling of being in a place where your father or your mother cannot give you cannot transfer something, or that's and also you mentioned this idea of theoretizing the periphery. So what are the different peripheries you've experienced, and is this, I mean, would you define this one of them?
Yeah, thank you for this question. This is actually a really interesting question because we all have our own ideas of what a periphery is, and we all, in a way, I believe, live in some sort of a periphery. And I think the idea for me came because I once was having, I used to have a lot of intense conversation with my father. The moment I became, I had two moments in my life where I realized I wasn't Emirati. The first one was during the Iraq-Kuwait war, when Iraq invaded Kuwait in the 90s, and I was celebrated a couple of months before that as an Iraqi because we had won the Iraq-Iran war and we were deemed heroes in the eyes of everybody in the Gulf. And then that happens, and all of a sudden the narrative completely changes. And bear in mind, I was 7 or 8 at that time, and all of a sudden I'm getting criticized for what my alleged country is doing. And I remember crying to my parents and saying, why are they talking to me about what he did? I'm not from there, I'm from here. And it felt like it was like one of those like movie like moments, like almost like comedy, where my dad had to sit me down and be like, I need to tell you something. It's like you're adopted, but you're not really adopted. This is not really your home. And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, and he started explaining to me what the visa is. And he's like, this is home. You were born here, but by the way, we need to be careful of what to say because you're not really from here. And that was very shocking for me, but I still didn't understand it. But then when I became an adult, and my father told me that we need to go do a blood test. And I'm like, for what? He's like, to renew your visa. I'm like, but why do they need my blood? What do they need to test in my blood? So he started explaining to me. I'm like, but that doesn't make any sense. Like, and this idea of needles piercing through my body to prove that I'm from here also was very shocking for me. Obviously, I was a very poetic, very sad, very angsty teenager and child, so I wrote a lot about that. But then I remember telling him, are we the هل إحنا الهامش? So do we live on the Hamish? And he's like, no, we don't. We live on, his theory was we are the central paragraph. I'm like, no, we're not. We're the Hamish. We are the footnotes, you know? And I really genuinely believe that I spent 10 years after that trying to understand how do I make sense of my existence in a place that I believe and my family believe that we are the periphery. We are just guests. We do not belong here. How do you contribute? How do you grow right? So these are the questions that kept running in my mind. And my answer to that was create a stellar resume, unbelievable achievements, you know, like a book of, like a portfolio of achievements, so that I can maybe move from the periphery to the center. And I think this has been and continues to be my life's work.
Mace, your work is a periphery, actually, because you started with the weather forecast, and I want to ask you, what's the news from the La Makan?
Yeah, I mean, I struggle to put my thoughts into words, because also we think a lot about the, you know, kind of networks of power, and I mean power very broadly, and kind of distribution of power. And I think my frustration, I keep saying frustration because I think that's one of the kind of biggest drives of my work, is like, can we even imagine a new book? And I don't want to repeat myself, but I think this is also why I find myself even, you know, outside of work, always attracted to, you know, alternative reality fiction and you know, fantasy and sci-fi. And I think, you know, even in those genres, it seems always difficult to disengage from the main book. And it's always thinking about, and you know, there's, it's difficult because it's also, we have immediate things that we always need to think about and kind of, and address and problematize, etc. But the, again, the frustration is always, can we find, maybe it's not a book, can we write on the walls? Can we, I don't know, not use words? I don't know, you know, the issue always seems to me is that we're always trying to solve a problem in relation to it, or within its same framework. And so, I mean, building something from the periphery in seems building something else from the periphery in seems like an exciting way to do it.
But what is the in?
I don't
That's
know.
exactly. And
Yeah.
where do you want to belong to that in? That's.
I don't think there's an
Like,
answer.
how
I think
can
that's
you,
like
how can you widen the in? Probably.
And I
Does
think
it have to be an?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
or
think
the-
it's also like, I think it's a quintessential immigrant experience,
Yes.
right? Like, so this is not unique to here only. It's a global thing. Immigrants, when immigrants, or even people who feel like they're not part of a specific place. So like, even like for me, always this idea of estrangement is not necessarily because you don't belong here. I mean, what does that actually mean? I mean, if you talk about Arab tribes, my father comes from a tribe that originates from Shibh al-Jazira, right? So like, technically he is from here, but they migrated like 800 or 900 years ago to the north of Iraq. But it's not about where you're from. I think there is an experience, a global experience that a lot of people share with very unique characteristics that are special to the Gulf and specifically the UAE, because the UAE has a very interesting story about its people and the co-creation that has happened in the last 50 years. But I think it's like you said, the frustration or sadness or melancholy, it starts at a young age, and you're trying to do something, but then you grow up and you're still doing it, but you actually don't know where you're going. Like, what do you want? And I've often asked that question, what do you want? Like, yani, because it's not paperwork, right? It's not about paperwork. There's something, but I honestly don't know what it is.
Because if you know, just to be super kind of immediate and maybe didactic in a sense, is if the goal is citizenship, you get a citizenship, and then what? Nothing actually changes.
Exactly.
You know, I mean,
It's-
obviously immediate things change and immediate privileges become available to a certain extent, but I don't think that's actually the thing that that's not the thing that we're
This
talking
is the
about.
bureaucracy of belonging,
Yeah.
but belonging as a concept is something that is, I guess, that is a bit wider, because even, I mean, Hashel, you belong, but at the same time you don't. You are Emirati, but so I think it a bit transcends this idea. I want to read here a quote that I find it really, really inspiring by Homi Bhabha. He said, home may be a mode of living made into a metaphor of survival. It's as if home is a territory of both disorientation and relocation, with all the fragility and fecundity implied by such a double take. So, Hashel, would it be, I mean, is survival part of your definition of belonging and your definition of journeys? Because in the last conversation we had, it's almost as if you're saying it's time for another journey.
Yeah, for sure. I think, for me, I always think of the environment at large as something that I need to respond to, regardless of where that environment is, and trying to make sense and find home. But then sometimes you exhaust your own resources. You need more cheese to continue, and I think it's important to realize that, because the danger, once you keep repeating your own self, there isn't innovation in the process, and that's becomes dead air, and there isn't enough progress, because progress comes through dialogue, and if we're all speaking the same language, we're just sitting having a cup of tea, and that's good, temporary, but then how are we progressing? I think that's where you need to know where you come in and then when you leave, and when do you contribute, and when do you actually go back and sit in the classroom and just listen and watch. I think finding the balance and being zen with your ideas, regardless of who you are or what identity you would like to identify yourself with, finding that balance is important. I just want to add few things, maybe just respond to Maryam. In a way, we're also, every 5 years we have to renew our passport. Maybe not as frequent as you, 2 years, but there is a process also to get a validation. There is a process of also getting the healthcare and all of that. So it's similar in a way in its process, I'm sure, each one to their own journey and the way they look at it. But at large, we're all going through the same thing. It's just but I think UAE have proved itself to be a welcoming platform for everyone who can prove themselves that they can deliver, and that's important.
Mes, you want to add something? But before I ask you this question, and we're closing, but Maryam, you said that actually almost the space of, maybe it wasn't a space of estrangement, but maybe it was a feeling of estrangement, but that we very much led to a space of engagement, just this proof of existence, that this journey that you went on. And Mace also, can you comment a little bit more of this concept of proof of existence?
I think there's a lot of love. في كثير حب to your home, to the place where you grew up and you were born and raised, and where you hopefully will also, die. And this is something I dream of. I dream of al-mustaqar, right? The last stage of my life. I dream that it's here, in the place in the land, in the soil that I consider home. So familiar to me. It's something I will never ever take for granted, though. But the proof of existence is something that is so ingrained in this generation, because we had to. And I think this is going to be very different in response to what you were saying, that the UAE is also extremely versatile. It keeps changing as the world shifts and changes. And the reality that we've lived in is very different than the younger generation, who are now told that they can have longer-term residencies, they can apply for national sports teams, they can do this and that. Obviously, this is a very new country, and things are shifting and changing. But for this generation, we had to prove that we are worthy of staying in a place that we wanted to accept us the way that we were. And hence, what my friend painfully described as the middle-class struggle to constantly be the best and the first and awa'il al-dawla and getting the best. And by 100% the same. I know that she's also nerded out in high school like I did, and getting like the best grades and getting the scholarships and achieving this and starting that because you have to. Otherwise, there's no place for you. But that's not the story right now, but that was our story.
Yeah, I think I'm off now. No. Thank you. There's a defining thing in my, I see it in my siblings and my cousins where the question of excellence defined in a very general term is tied to existence. It is not tied to just success on a material level, but it's tied to very basic, very basic expectations of life, I think. And so the one thing that I've been thinking a lot about in my work is, and the reason why I was looking at the body is I wanted to think of how do you prove your existence beyond a meritocracy, because there's a lot to talk about in if we think of it as just a meritocracy, and thinking of just your body. And there's a lot of problems in that as well, because then how do you also define your relationship to places where your body is not always present? And so it's and I don't have answers, and I don't know anything beyond the fact that I existed somewhere, and that's something that is irrefutable, essentially.
What's a wonderful situation to be in is actually to be in a place and to want to be in that place. And I think it's already in a position of privilege, because all over the world, so many times we are in places where we do not want to be. Do you want to add anything else? Well, thank you so much. And it's been fascinating. I mean, I loved hearing, I know a bit of it, but it's been really quite inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya.
Shukran. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya.
Thank you, Hashel. Thank you.